Hi, I'm Keon, a research analyst with Lipper, and I'm here to speak to you about fund flows for the week ended Wednesday, February 25th. Let's start by taking a quick look at the market activity for the week. The Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P 500 Index experienced gains of 1.1% and 0.7% for the week. The markets were driven by two pieces of news. Greece reached a bailout extension with the Eurozone finance ministers for another 4 months, while back here in the U.S., Fed Chairwoman Yellen's testimony before Congress gave confidence to the street that the Fed wouldn't look to raise interest rates till June at the soonest. Let's turn our attention back now to fund flows. Last week, we saw aggregate net inflows of approximately $16.1 billion. This aggregated data includes both mutual funds and ETFs. Let's take a look at our macro groups now. All four macro groups experienced positive net inflows for the week. Equity mutual funds took in $900 million. Taxable bond mutual funds took in $3.0 billion. Muni bond funds came in at $280 million in net flows, while money market funds paced the group with net inflows of approximately $10.1 billion. Let's take a closer look at our equity mutual fund group now. The $900 million in inflows that we saw last week was only the second week in 8 for the year to date that the equity mutual fund group experienced net inflows. This is a bit of a turnaround from the last couple years where equity mutual funds have bounced back from the financial crisis and took in large amounts of net inflows. Taking a closer look at this week's data, we see a continuing trend that we saw for a good part of last year as well as this year, where non-domestic equity funds accounted for the bulk of the net inflows, in fact all of them this week with $1.6 billion, while domestic equity funds saw $700 million leave their coffers. Moving on now, let's take a look at our equity ETF category. They had net inflows of $600 million for the week. This is their third consecutive week of positive net flows. ETF investors were buying last week. The iShares Core S&P Mid-Cap ETF took in around $500 million, while the Deutsche X-Trackers MSCI EFA Hedged Equity ETF took in about $440 billion. On the sell side, we saw the Spider S&P 500 ETF had about $2.2 billion in net outflows, while the iShares Russell 2000 had about $1.8 billion in outflows. Moving on now, let's take a look at our taxable bond mutual fund group. For the week, as stated before, they had net inflows of $3 billion. So far for the year to date, they've had positive net flows in every week, which brings their year-to-date net inflows at roughly $32.5 billion. Leading the way this week were funds in the Core Plus Bond Fund category, which took in about $1.1 billion, followed by the High Yield Group, which had net inflows of just over $600 million. Let's take a closer look at our taxable bond ETF category now. The group had $1.1 billion in net inflows for the week. It's their 7th consecutive week, so similar to the mutual funds, investors are flocking to taxable bond ETFs as well, which brings their year-to-date total for net inflows to $18.1 billion. In ETF activity last week, we saw that the largest increase was in the iShares Core U.S. Treasury Bond ETF, which took in just over $400 million. Conversely, and somewhat interestingly, two other iShares Treasury products had significant net outflows last week. The 7 to 10 year Treasury ETF saw net outflows of over $800 million, while the 3 to 7 year Treasury ETF had net outflows of over $200 million. Let's take a closer look at our Muni Bond Fund category now. They had positive net inflows again. This is for every week this year. They've had positive net flows. They took in $280 million last week, bringing their year-to-date total to $4.4 billion. And once again, leading the way for the group were the funds in the National Muni categories, which had positive inflows of $230 million. Let's move on to our last category now, money market funds. Money market funds had the largest gains last week, had positive net flows of $10.1 billion. Similar to equity funds, it's only the second week this year where they've had positive net flows. So for the year to date, they have overall net outflows of $40.3 billion, Last week's activity was paced by the institutional money markets, which took in approximately $13.5 billion. Well, that does it for this week's report. If you'd like to take a deeper dive, a closer look at the data, please join us at our website, www.lipperusfundflows.com. And please join us here again next week, where another analyst will be speaking to you about the weekly fund flow activity.